when it comes to this. And I would say here that this discussion is really about asking for example, the European Muslims or the Western Muslims. We are not going to get at that level if you're not self-critical. If you don't start with your own empowerment, and it means, you know, in the same book I'm speaking about the 7 C's, one of them is creativity. It's cultural contribution. Because at the end, to feel that you are European, you need to have architecture, you need to have paintings, you need to have art, you need to have mosques that are built with this taste at home. Don't come with a Moroccan mosque in Sweden. That's fine, it's nice. But what about the Swedish taste in Sweden? It's at home, it's you, to be creative in that field. Your songs, as we have, you know, Islamic songs, we have Arabic terms and verses and what's that? There is a lack of universal take that puts you yourself in a segregated cultural attitude. So you can't feel at home. And it's not in our mosques. When the way we talk about them outside, the way we talk about this culture. So we are very happy in the UK that curry is becoming a national dish and they are all happy with that. What about the contribution? The contribution, artistic contribution, intellectual contribution. I was talking recently with Parak, Lord Parak. He's a Hindu. He said, you know the problem that we have with Muslims, why I don't feel the same as a Hindu, is that when I'm talking on the intellectual landscape, I'm making a contribution, and I'm perceived as making a common contribution. Islam today is a political problem with no common contribution, intellectual contribution, no intellectual participation. And I would say if you want to be part of this narrative, you have to be within the intellectual debate, within the intellectual production, creativity. If not, you cannot blame the people to perceive you as the other. If you yourself, you are self-nurturing this perception for yourself and for the other. It's a two-way process. The sense of belonging is coming from empowerment from within first, and not waiting for the people to empower you, which is a contradiction in truth. My conclusion here is really to come from this to the narrative. So I'm just trying to follow this. My next book is called Our West Towards the New Narrative, which is really coming to this, straight to the point, the narrative, the common narrative, as to the past, as to the culture, as to the values. And trying to tackle the issue of the narrative, understanding that if we are not going to tackle this, all this discussion about being a citizen are going to be useless and sometimes counterproductive because the problem is not there. Now, having said this, tackling the narrative, at the same time as a political and civil actor, I should come with the right questions to my society. What about unemployment? What about structural racism? What about discrimination? What about women in our society? The true questions to be asked at the same time, questioning the narrative as part of the society. Not on the margin, but in the mainstream. And this is from where I think that we can reconcile the formal and informal dimensions of our common citizenship. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Roland. It's very interesting talk. Our next speaker is Professor Liben Björkman, who is well known in Sweden. Professor Björkman is the first woman holding perhaps the oldest professorship chair of political science in the world, being the Johan Skytte Professor of Eloquence and Political Science at Uppsala University. Liben Björkman has been doing research about political culture and institutional transformation. So she has written extensively about post-communist states, new members of the European Union, on issues related to citizenship and to democracy, to immigration, and also about academic freedom. These are just some few examples of topics which have engaged Professor Björkman. It's a great pleasure, Professor Björkman, to greet you welcome and to talk about not political rights only, citizenship in historical and contemporary light. Please.
Then we heard the former speaker, and then we will also have some discussion afterwards, yes. As was also said in the introduction, I'm a political scientist, and that means also that I will approach this from a more of a, let's say, political or democratization angle, which I think is also quite important here today, also in the sense of what is happening in the world presently. So the 19th and 20th centuries have seen waves of democratization sweeping over the world, and even if you could say that all such waves, as the late Samuel Huntington metaphorically called these continued periods of democratization, have been followed also by backlashes and by states caught up in oscillation between democracy and authoritarianism. You could also say that democracy as a regime type has successively become more and more of a kind of universal global strive. And that is actually, or at least you could say, is on a rhetorical level. So there is nothing controversial today, or almost nothing controversial at least, about institutionalizing popular elections and rule by the people, as it used to be if we just move back 100 years ago, which is historically quite a short period, you could say. At that time, the profound distrust of the political judgment of the mass public was openly and often freely articulated, not to speak of the let's say, distrust of judgment of particularly women. Now, it is instead the opposite that stands out as an anomaly, you could say. To remain distinctly authoritarian and non-democratic is not a popular choice in today's world. And particularly that could be said for the kind of eyes of the so-called international community, that is the organizations and institutions at the international and supranational level that works with this kind of issues today. And yet you could say that it is quite interesting, I think, this process of how democracy has become this kind of universal or almost universal global strive, because democracy is not an easy path to tread upon. Because practiced correctly, it rests really upon profound and continuous uncertainty about one of the major resources in human societies, that is political power. It rests on the willingness of political incumbents to voluntarily step down from power, but also on their willingness not to use the resources of the state to avoid such a fate. So, democracy is thus very difficult as a regime choice, and that goes for political contenders and for citizens, I think, alike. Furthermore, it remains almost a puzzle, at least to me at least, that elites, historically and also today, are forced or are, let's say, convinced about that they should introduce democracy in the first place. So that's, you could think about that as a real puzzle in itself. Anyway, an essential consequence of this global victory of democracy as a meta-ideology, you could say, has been a steadily growing concern and interest in those who hold the ultimate power to choose in their hands, that is the people. Those who through often lengthy processes of liberalization and democratization are transformed from subjects to citizens. And even though every government, you could say, be it totalitarian or authoritarian or patrimonial, we call them, entertains some kind of relationship with those who are governed and try to consolidate legitimacy in some form, in a state or in a federation that calls itself democratic, the role played by those governed is still uniquely important and decisive. That is, of course, not to say that other spheres of power are not important at all. I mean, of course, there is such a kind of power struggle and power balance all the time. But you could say that due to this kind of victory of democracy globally or in a historical perspective, the role of the citizens has grown. Manipulation, election fraud, and various forms of repression for certain takes place in democratic states and takes place all the time. But still you could say that the voices and the votes of the citizens can make and break political power. And that is really crucial here. So hence you could say that both in academia, and not least then within the discipline of political science, where I come from, in media and among political elites, there is an interest, a growing interest, to explore the values, the opinions, the attitudes and the behavior of the citizens. And these interests, you could say, these kind of concerns have exploded during the last 50 to 60 years, accompanying the actual regime changes and giving us more and more information about the ordinary men and women that make up the public. Just to take a few examples, opinion polls are, for example, frequently reported in the media, followed intensively in political parties and governing bodies. There are large-scale surveys with a global outreach that are mapping the values and attitudes of the mass publics, the most prominent one being World Value Survey today. So we today also know a great deal about political participation, such as voting behavior, political consumption, civil society engagement, and civil disobedience. And parallelly we have a discussion both in academia and outside on the problematization and understanding of the concept of citizenship, as we just heard. So now, no doubt then that the 20th century has seen a shift in interest from elites to the public that makes the issue of citizenship into one of the hottest and most salient of our time. What is the importance of the citizens and their actions in relation to performance of the system? Do they matter, or are elites still the crucial actors, those that really matters? Here today I will take the position that citizens' behavior, their values and expectations matters greatly to the quality of democracy and the quality of government, not least. Understand basically as quality of government as practices of corruption, practices of patronage and that kind of issues. That is not to say, I think, that the elites are unimportant, specifically in formative periods of change. But in a sense, citizens in democracy get the elites they deserve, I could say, to be a bit, to take it a bit far. What is often of concern in more normative debates about democracy and the processes of democratization is, however, not just citizenship as such, I think, but the realization of what I here would like to call a reflective citizenship. What do I mean by that? I use it here in a sense of citizens who not only have political rights on paper, but who genuinely feel that they have the possibility to exercise control over their own lives, to be empowered, as Professor Ramadan just said before, to meaningfully and not only ritualistically engage in the choice that elections provide, to be able to inform themselves about societal issues in order to make the choices demanded of them, and to appeal and even protest decisions by authorities that are considered unjust or simply wrong. So in the concept of reflective citizenship lies a kind of critical reflexivity that I think Jürgen Habermas has very nicely and interestingly elaborated upon in his work on the Öffentlichkeit, on the public sphere. The critically reflective citizens that make democracy work better are able to assess and critically judge information. They are able to problematize and question political messages and are ready to take on a certain amount of responsibility themselves. A public sphere in which these kind of qualities can be nurtured is thus a crucial precondition also for such a citizenship to be, let's say, developed. This, of course, is a demanding definition of citizenship in a democracy, and it is demanding not only of the state and societies, but of the individual themselves. And that is because I think reflective citizenship requires engagement in a sense. Maybe it requires all the kind of loyalty and also these kind of qualities, but it requires particularly engagement.